and I'm the principal of Massey College, its directrice principale. Massey College is built on Indigenous land, the cherished land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. We want to acknowledge their stewardship of the land and express our gratitude to the ability that we have to gather here today to discuss a crisis, the climate change crisis. The world was supposed to be in Glasgow today and for next week to measure progress, to learn, discuss, commit to act, recommit to act on climate change. But the world is not in Glasgow because of the pandemic. The meeting will be held next year, and Massey wants to do its part to ensure that we are prepared for COP26, as it is called. Many junior fellows and many senior fellows and members of the Quadrangle Society are really committed to this issue. They're working on it and they are very active. And many more, all of us, are very interested, very concerned. It is certainly an intergenerational equity issue, and it's a crisis that affects us all. This series, therefore, is to educate ourselves and see what can be done to prepare Canada for the meeting in Glasgow next year. I want to thank the inspiration for this series, our resident visiting scholar in foreign and defense policy and former ambassador of Canada to the UN, Rosemary McCarney, and a former environmental commissioner for Ontario, Diane Sachs, and our very own production director, Abra Rissi, for this great series. You're in for a treat today as the former Premier for Ontario, Kathleen Wynne, who was at Paris, will explain and talk a little bit about how to make things happen at an international meeting. She will be joined by our junior fellows, Rushay Naik. I'm going to pass the virtual mic to Rosemary.
Thank you very much, Natalie. It's a pleasure to be back here. You'll notice I have the wisdom windows of Massey College's beautiful upper library behind me. So welcome to Massey College, everyone, for our conversation with Kathleen Wynne and Massey Junior Fellow Rushay Naik. Massey is missing COP26, and so COP26 and our Massey Missing series is a 5 conversations, intergenerational conversations and events that we're going to have take place through the period of the now postponed COP26 event, which, as Natalie mentioned, was supposed to have taken place in Scotland this year between November 9th and 19th. So we're reflecting back on the early years of climate and political activism, more recent history and the breakthrough Paris Climate Agreement in 2015, to climate negotiations gaming simulation we'll do next week, to the role of financing for climate change transitions, and to the importance of the arts and the culture in mobilizing public engagement and action on climate heating. It is a full and fulsome arc of contemporary history on this critical challenge to our planet. And today, we're very lucky, but I am joined by Kathleen Wynne and Rushay Naik. Kathleen Wynne needs a little introduction, our 25th Premier of Ontario, who has dedicated her professional life to building a better place for all of us here in Ontario. And she's done so guided by a spirit of diversity, of collaboration, of fairness, of creativity. She's held many, many portfolios where she brought her expertise and her spirit and her passion to them, from the Minister of Municipal Affairs and Housing, Minister of Aboriginal Affairs, the Minister of Transportation, the Minister of Education, and the Minister of Agriculture and Food. Fast forward to today, in 2015, Kathleen also led the Ontario delegation as part of Canada's official delegation to COP21 and witnessed the success of the negotiations of the Paris Climate Agreement. So welcome, Kathleen.
A pleasure. Thanks, Rosemary.
You're very welcome, and thank you. We're joined by Rushay Naik, who is a graduate student in health policy at the Institute of Health Policy Management and Evaluation here at the University of Toronto's Dalai Lama School of Public Health, and he's a junior fellow at Massey College. Rushay has been a fellow at U of T's School of Cities, the Center for the Study of the Presidency and the Congress in Washington, D.C., very useful these days, and is currently a research fellow with the University of Oxford's COVID-19 Government Response Chapter, hosted at the Blavatnik School of Government. So welcome to you, Rushay, as well.
Thanks so much, Rosemary.
Today is have a conversation about what happened at Paris 5 years ago, where we achieved a very rare and unusual consensus outcome on a very ambitious plan, and what's happened since. And in general, we want to discuss what made COP21 work, and are we ready for COP26, now taking place a year from now because of being postponed? And what has to happen before the Canadian delegation returns to COP26 in just 12 months? I'm going to ask Kathleen or Rushay a few questions, and then I'm going to turn to the audience for questions. And if you would, post your questions in the Q&A platform at the bottom of your screen. If you'd like to make some comments or pose questions to either of our guests. So let me begin, and I'm going to begin with you, Kathleen. You are, without a doubt, the perfect guest for this discussion. You led the Ontario delegation at COP21 as a senior member of the Canadian delegation, which I remember seemed to be everywhere at once in Paris in those negotiations, just a formidable presence of Canadians. And the world then celebrated the ambitious outcomes that really seemed impossible at that time. Could you share with us what was it like on the ground, and kind of what were the magic ingredients that were taking place there that allowed this outcome to happen?
Yeah, thanks, Rosemary. It is it's really great to have an opportunity to talk about this. I think I said to you when we spoke in the sort of rehearsal that it was a heady time. It felt very much like there was a confluence, certainly for us here in Ontario, there was a confluence of forces and political will that made us feel very optimistic. And that's when I think back on that time. I went twice. I went once when the Prime Minister was there, Prime Minister Trudeau, and I went once when the subnational meetings were happening. And I felt very, very good about Ontario's ability to tell our story and to be able to influence other people. And I think when I look back on it, that's sort of the outcome that I come away with, because I had never been to a meeting on climate change like that before, not an international meeting. I didn't know exactly how they went, but I feel when I look back on it that it was a very optimistic time. There was a lot of energy for moving forward. We felt like we had here in Canada, with a new Prime Minister who was supportive of the work that provinces were doing to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, we felt that we could make progress and that we could have an influence on that international stage. So that's the overarching sense that I have, and I can talk about the details of that.
Well, that's very helpful, because sometimes I think you're right. There's a moment in time where a number of things come together, and it's an inflection point. And that year was also the year that the Sustainable Development Goals came together and were signed. So there was a lot happening in multilateralism at that point, where the world did really seem to come together. And so it's those magic moments when you have to really push hard.
And it was interesting because for us, we'd been sort of slogging away here in Canada without a national partner, because the previous Conservative government had not been supportive. They had not wanted to work with us. But even in the face of that, under Dalton McGuinty, we had shut down the coal-fired plants, and I continued that work. We had joined the Western Climate Initiative, but we had not implemented cap and trade, and I was determined to do that, and we were in the process of doing that. And once Prime Minister Trudeau was elected, and we knew, even though we were pretty sure he was going to be going for a carbon tax, as British Columbia had in place, and we were more leaning with Quebec and with California on cap and trade. That didn't matter as much as just having a federal partner, and that felt like it gave us the boost. So I wasn't just going to COP21 as a subnational that was doing a lot of important work, although I was willing to do that and I felt good about that. And I'd like to come back and talk about the subnational impact. But I was going now as part of a Team Canada effort, and that, I think that really fueled the optimism for us here in Ontario.
Right. Did you, in that experience of those, both times you were there and then came back, did you feel that there were major shifts in the negotiations, or did it just kind of unfold incrementally and consistently, or were there big puts and takes that happened during that period of negotiations? So,
Rosemary, that I wasn't physically at the table where the negotiation was taking place, but from where I was sitting, it felt like, because the leadership of both the subnationals and the national governments were as positive as they were, that the roadblocks at the table moved more easily, and that's certainly what my team said, that they knew that we had their back. They knew that they could rely on their leadership to be supportive. And so they were able to, because I can only imagine the language negotiations that go on, but I felt that there was incremental progress. I'm quite sure someone who was at the table would tell you there were moments where they didn't know if they were going to be able to get there, but that didn't break through and change the mood or the tenor of the larger event. I guess that's what I experienced.
That's very helpful. Let's bring Rushay in now as well. Rushay, let me ask you a question. And youth engagement on the climate action file has just taken off. It's grown tremendously since COP21 over the last 5 years, with the Friday school climate strikes and mass marches that were happening around the globe before the COVID shutdowns, inspired by Greta Thunberg, but also taken up by youth activism in Canada by students like Sophia Matur, who we had on our first in this series from Sudbury, with Emma Marnick in Whitehorse, and Chase Cardinal in Calgary, and so many other just extraordinary young youth activists who are really putting kind of passion, energy, and their intelligence behind this file, this needing attention. What do you think has changed in these last 5 years in terms of the role of youth in these global summits? Because that wasn't something we could take for granted before, and I don't think we're going to be able to take for granted going forward. But given the momentum that's been created since 2015, can you comment on that?
Sure thing. Thanks. It's a great question, Rosemary. And I personally wasn't at COP21, but I think we can almost look at a progression sort of over time of what the environment over the past few 5 years looks like. I remember as I was 17 in 2015, I remember the kind of jubilation that came out of Paris, and I think what was most memorable were the headlines. You saw in the news, as Kathleen mentioned, the Team Canada approach, securing this incredible agreement. And I think for youth, it was this inspiring moment. You saw the Prime Minister, you saw cabinet, ministers, you saw figures like Elizabeth May, yourself, Kathleen, joining hands and kind of sharing in this moment. And so for youth, there was this learning moment, I think, of how these sorts of institutions have an impact on climate change, and the nature of achieving what looked like a global consensus on the climate change issue. 5 years later, I'm now 22. I'm of voting age. Perhaps a little bit more wise about the limitations of global governance and the institutions. And I think more than ever, we have the science. The IPCC report came out, a couple years later, telling us that we had to take some measures in order to, restrict our global warming to 1.5 degrees by 2030. And so I think there was this real sense that the urgency became real. and quite gravely clear. And I think we saw that, manifested, as you mentioned, in the climate strikes last year. This mass coalition of youth, across the board, organizing both in local communities and then coming together to emphasize the need for change. I think the question now is, are youth voices being taken up in these circles, right? At global forums like international conferences of this sort, intergovernmental sort of closed door meetings. Are we seeing these sorts of values emerge in dialogue, at those venues? I can point to, there's an article that came out a few days ago by a few U of T students, and I'll name them Zahrin Tarafdar and Michaela Tam, and they write about their experience last year at COP25 in Madrid. And, this is the conference, where we saw on the plenary stage, right? Greta Thunberg and other activists, were able to take the stage, in front of negotiators. And at that very same event, we also saw, racialized and indigenous youth demonstrators, who were debadged, removed from the conference, right? A really interesting juxtaposition of how, of the values, we bring into the conference and what the outcomes were. So, I hope that at COP26, the role of youth will change, especially in light of what's coming up, the global stocktake that's coming up next year. And, whether we'll see youth allowed to push up on those national contributions and have that dialogue emerge in that conversation. I just hope that we'll see governments listen.
Thank you very much for that, because I do think that momentum that you're talking about, that the students are just creating that momentum, and now they expect, quite rightly, to be taken up on it. And multilateral negotiations have always been about state parties negotiating in large rooms, etc. And it has not always been about multi-stakeholderism. And I think with climate change in particular, you're hopefully not pushing a rock up a hill, because the acknowledgement and the cognizance of the complexity and the need for the intergenerational voices that Massey was always embracing is critical. Voices across the spectrum, of course, but I think there's this, I would say sometimes not excited shift, a kind of an anxious shift would probably be the best way, an anxious shift to more multi-stakeholder approaches on multilateralism and multilateral negotiations and summits, etc. Let me shift back to Kathleen, because you mentioned wanting to come back to that unique perspective at the subnational level, which is another aspect of this multilateral world where the subnational levels of government haven't always been included or listened to. And you're in a unique perspective as a political leader and a progressive voice on these issues at a subnational level. But when you put it into the climate context, there's a lot of literature that would say we have to have a global framework. That's what we need for climate mitigation to get us to a 1.5 Celsius world, because every country's carbon emissions is affecting every other country's carbon emissions. So we need negotiations and collaborations like at COP21 to protect the global commons. But climate adaptation and the real strong effects and impact that is felt by individuals is different, because it's always at the local level, isn't it? Provincial or regional or municipal or at a community level. And it doesn't depend on getting agreements at some summit. And it really doesn't impact someone even down the road, let alone across a country like Canada, unless it's something catastrophic. Massive floods in Quebec, or, the tsunami that broke through a seawall that hit a nuclear reactor in Japan. Then all of a sudden it's, climate adaptation is global. But, closer to home, if Halifax builds a seawall because sea levels are rising, or because the hurricanes are getting more severe in the North Atlantic because of global warming, it doesn't impact or assist Vancouver, who has to put massive investments into its infrastructure because of sea level rises, or Tuktoyaktuk, where the tundra is melting, doing damage to both livelihoods and to infrastructure. And so, I think of Ontario, where we are. You're a big believer in the role of the subnational levels of government and solutions. And so Ontario, here we are. You know, we are stewards of the major waterways of the world, the fresh waterways of the world. We are sitting on the largest international border anywhere in the world. We've got the near Arctic in the province in Hudson Bay. What can you talk about that subnational role, and how will it cope, and, you know, all the way down to the massive impacts it's having on municipalities?
Yeah, and I think that's a really important connection to make, Rosemary. I guess the way I saw our role was that we were of course very engaged in the adaptation. I'll be honest with you, we could have been more engaged in the adaptation discussion. I think that we, you know, we were working with municipalities. We were investing billions of dollars in infrastructure money, in transit dollars. You know, we were doing a lot of investment to try to deal with some of those adaptation issues. But I would say that in my time when I went to COP21 and in the lead up to that, when my Minister of the Environment, Glenn Murray, was there as well, we were really focused on pushing the mitigation agenda, that because we had been a subnational in a national context where there wasn't federal support, we were determined to do everything that we could to push an agenda that could become national. You know, we're the largest province in the country. You know, you've got 40% of the people in this province, and when you add Quebec, you've got the vast majority of the people who live in this country live in Ontario and Quebec. And Quebec was ahead of us in terms of cap and trade. So I really felt strongly that we needed to take that message to COP21. You know, we needed to, before I knew Trudeau was going to be elected, our objective was to make sure that we played on the international stage by telling our story, by being clear that there was work that those subnationals could do, that provinces and states working with municipalities, because really, let's face it, even the mitigation strategies that are national come down to an implementation and an acceptance at those more local levels. You know, I mean, we've seen that in Canada. Prime Minister Trudeau has got a vision for climate change action in this country, but it looks different province by province because of the provincial leadership. So I felt very, very strongly that we as subnationals needed to take our place. We needed to make it clear that it was great what national governments were doing and we needed to push them. But whether they were acting or not, we needed to be taking action, and that we could take action that would have an impact on the mitigation strategy across our country and internationally. And that happened. You know, at COP21, I had governors of states on small islands in the Pacific coming to me and saying, so how did this work? How did you do this? I said, well, within the powers that we have as a province, we did what we could. And that, you know, that felt like there was an emboldenment that went on. And I felt very good about that, because I think that in previous meetings, my understanding was there hadn't necessarily been that same subnational presence. And so I think that was a good development, and probably led, and I'll stop after this, but probably led to some of what, Rushay, what you were saying, because it was very visible to young people. One of the things I did when I was there was I spoke to a group of young people about what we had been doing. And my hope was always that the torch would be picked up by young people. And I think to a large extent it has. We have to continue to work together. But young people know way too much about climate change now for this to fall off their radar screens.
Absolutely. So, Rushay, you know, Kathleen has tossed that to you, because it's not just about the subnational public state actors of provinces and communities and municipalities, but do you think that youth climate activists are sufficiently focused on local climate action and why it's so important? Sometimes I feel that, you know, there's a focus on the big summits, there's a focus on the national government without a really an understanding, a powerful understanding of the opportunities within a federal system like Canada for moving and influencing public policy. So, you know, the real impact might lie, you know, when you look at the floods and you look at the rolling floods and the rolling wildflowers and the drought so close to home, you know, do you think youth activism and all the power that they're bringing to this file are sufficiently focused on that, on the sub-level, subnational governments?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, you know, I wholeheartedly agree with Kathleen, you know, that you know, youth are primarily kind of centered in local action, right? I believe personally that all diplomacy is local. You know, the idea that youth are working in their communities is a truth for very real reasons. You know, in 2030, Rosemary, I'm going to be 32, right? This is the defining issue of my lifetime, and for many youth, it's going to be, you know, in their careers, in their livelihoods. This will be the primary issue, and so whether or not we are able to avoid the most catastrophic impacts of, you know, overshooting that 1.5 degree mark is a question of what we do now. And, you know, our generation really doesn't have a choice about whether to engage, but I know that we are. You know, I can speak to my experience. I've organized with Climate Justice Toronto, as you know, as well as you know, other sorts of national initiatives and sort of international solidarity movements that other youth are participating in. And you know, they work both in the city, right? We're anchored in our local chapters, but also broadly speaking. And before the pandemic, you know, I think a great example is that we were organizing towards a Green New Deal in Canada, and that was to bring a legislative fold into our activism, you know, here at home, especially, you know, on the question of how do we decarbonize the economy while ensuring we leave no one behind. And that was kind of this organizing principle. And so, you know, we mobilized during the 2019 federal election, you know, even to the point of developing the ideas in the Green New Deal, what a Canadian version would look like. And it was even introduced as a motion, I believe, in the House of Commons. I think it was Peter Julian, if I remember correctly. And so that was the momentum, you know, going into the pandemic. You know, but I think when we talk about imagery, right, this idea of, you know, the events that are happening around us that you're talking about, you know, I think we have to get to a point of having, you know, a genuine national conversation of how we meet such a significant challenge on the local level, you know, and in very real policy terms. You know, there are numbers, you know, everywhere these days, but with, there was one that's quite important, environmental defense. Canada, you know, ran a report that said that we still, at the federal and provincial levels, subsidize oil and gas producers to the tune of about $3.3 billion a year, right? And that's almost unconscionable in an environment in which we're trying to, you know, decarbonize the economy and our energy systems. And so in what we call a just transition, and that's a transition that is centered in justice towards a decarbonized system, you know, these sorts of funds and supports that governments are providing need to be redirected, you know, towards supporting the development of, you know, a renewable source energy grid, or, you know, retrofitting. And those are subnational concerns. Those are provincial concerns, right? They're inherently tied to local governance and the kind of hard work that happens, you know, at those levels. And so, you know, with the global pandemic now in mind and questions of racial and social equity, I think, you know, while youth movements were not able to gather in the spaces that we traditionally were, you know, we're still seeing youth movements in the streets, right? Still compelling governments to ask the question, you know, how can we, you know, ensure that we leave no one behind now, as we term it, a just recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic. You know, youth are asking the policy questions that I think, you know, well ahead of government. Can we, you know, ensure that we're taking care of the worker in the oil industry, you know, whose income needs to be protected in a just transition, just as we need to ensure that, you know, labor laws for migrant farm workers are in place, you know, for those affected, because they're affected by the same sort of systems of you know, of corporate extractivism. And so, I think it would do that work a service if, if we deconstructed some of those complex governance and financing mechanisms that will surely be used in the jargon at COP26 and take it to a more human level. Can, diplomacy center, ensure that no one is left behind? And I think that's what we'll need to see for a true consensus at the global level.
And can I just add to what Rushay's saying, in that I think that young people have an incredibly important role to play in articulating that to political leaders. So I think the Friday climate action pieces, the energy that people took from Greta Thunberg and the Canadian activists, I think we need to help each other, help young people, support young people in channeling that into, okay, and now I'm 22 and I can vote, and this is what I expect of you, because I know that this is what's possible. Some of this is going to happen. I mean, I'm amused here in Ontario to see, for example, Doug Ford putting money into the building of electric vehicles, which we had been on a path to do. And we know that the carbon outputs of automobiles and those vehicles, traditional fossil fuel vehicles, and buildings, those are the two things that we really need to tackle in Ontario. So we were on a track around electric vehicles. He's now doing that. So I think young people need to see that momentum and push on it, because it will happen too slowly if people who fundamentally don't believe that action needs to be taken, if they then are not pushed by the next generation, I think we lose that momentum. Doug Ford's not going to listen to me. Scott Moe's not going to listen to me. Jason Kenney's not going to listen to me. Those provincial leaders are not going to listen to the people who they unseated. But they are going to listen to their next generation of voters who know more than them about what has to happen. And I think that's the stage we're at with young people at this point.
Well, you have both just responded to one of the comments in the chat room on the Q&A from Erica Walker, who said, as a senior activist, the junior activists need our support. They stand on the shoulders, but it's a big, massive job. So we really need to be joined up intergenerationally to be able to move these things. And you both have commented on that absolutely beautifully. So I think Erica has the response that she was looking for as well, or the endorsement of her perspective. Kathleen, if I could just move to, it's a little bit about what Rushay was saying, but the targets at COP21 require substantial decarbonization of our economy, meaning restructuring energy, housing, transportation, infrastructure. It implies massive economic, social, political shifts.
Yeah.
Question. You've held almost all of these portfolios, but in the absence of a global framework for regulating emissions that everyone signs up to, the big choices are really in the hands of the private sector. How companies and banks, investors decide what technologies they're going to advance, they're going to put in money behind, what's going to come to market, what won't come to market. How can public policy create the market conditions to get to a successful zero carbon economy? Is it more regulation that we need? Is it more incentivization that we need? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so this question pains me because, of course, I saw cap and trade as a market mechanism that actually would have and was moving us in that direction. So I think that in Ontario, particularly, I think it's going to have to be some combination of the other things that you're talking about, Rosemary. I think that, as I said, we just saw the Premier put, I don't know how much money, that hasn't been made public at this point, but put his shoulder to the wheel around electric vehicles, and working with the auto sector to create cleaner green vehicles. I mean, we're lucky in Ontario in that our electricity grid is pretty much clean. It's pretty much green because of the shutdown of the coal-fired plants. So, and I had leaders from other jurisdictions say, you did what? You shut down all your coal plants? And I said, yeah, we did that. And that was, Dalton had a vision of doing that, and we got there. So electric vehicles in Ontario make a lot of sense because we have a clean grid. Now, it's not as clean as it could be because we still have natural gas. And I worry a little bit that that the province is sending messages about green energy turbines and solar panels that is not a good one. And so I'm worried on that front. But I think that in the absence of cap and trade, which would have been that market mechanism, Rosemary, I think that we are looking at regulation. We are looking at incentives. The biggest issue, though, is for there to be a shift in political will at the provincial level. That's my biggest concern, because right now what we're seeing is a bit of a piecemeal, well, let's support this industry and we'll give some money to municipalities for this kind of adaptation. But I don't hear, because in Ontario and Saskatchewan and Manitoba and Alberta, you've got leadership that basically ran against the climate action of the Prime Minister. I mean, they were running against the carbon tax. They were running against decarbonization. So now they have to back into it because that's where the world is going. My concern is that we're just not going fast enough, that they need to be pushed to go faster. And so whatever we can do to present the kinds of solutions that Rushay was talking about, the kinds of things that we know have worked in other jurisdictions, we need to present those as economically viable and as triggers for economic growth, particularly now as we come out of the pandemic, or God willing, when we come out of the pandemic. The green recovery needs to be put forward as the innovative, most rational solution. And so those voices need to be very, very strong. This is a really critical moment. I think it's another inflection point, actually, where we need to be very clear about how economic growth is tied to greening the economy and dealing with carbonization. So organizations like Corporate Knights, for example, groups that are industrial leaders, commercial leaders, they need to step up now, and they know where the world's going. They see the writing on the wall, just like the auto sector see the writing on the wall, and they need to be, I think, joining hands with those young people and the political leaders to make this happen.
There's a question on two things that you just touched on. One is I think, well, let me just make a quick comment, a joiner comment, is that we have made incredible headway. I mean, people think that nothing is happening, but in fact, on electrical, it's kind of, yeah, we've done a great job. And where we've got to put the focus now is on transportation, agriculture, fossil fuels, right? They're the ones that have the biggest journey still to travel. A couple of questions that have come in is, how do you see the agreement with your belief in the subnational roles of government, but how do you kind of push and get the other subnationals on board from Ontario, who's been taking this lead? How do you see that happening in our very complex federal system?
By example. I think that, so if I think about going to the Premier's table when I was in that role, it was very important to me that I was able to take the story of what we were doing. Being the largest province in the country, you have to be a little bit careful about bossing people around. You have to be very careful about not sounding too arrogant or too much like you've figured everything out, because of course nobody has figured everything out. But it is compelling when you can come to the table, just like any province can come to the table and say, we've been able to do X, Y, and Z. We've been able to change our building code in these ways. We've been able to green our electricity grid in these ways. We've been able to support these industries that are moving forward. I mean, those are compelling stories because they're real and they're practical. I think right now, Rosemary, one of the realities is that the municipalities that are moving ahead need to pick up some of that mantle, you know, because we don't have a critical mass of provincial leaders who really want to tell that story. But if we have municipal leaders who are finding ways to do things in their own communities, those stories then push the provincial leadership to pay attention. So I think that when we say subnational, we're not just talking about state and province, we're talking about municipalities as well. And I think that there's a real role for the big cities, for example, in the country. They have a forum, they come together. I think they can play a role right now in pushing the provincial leadership, which in turn then dovetails with what the federal government is trying to do. So we're kind of having to push from the top and the bottom now.
Right, and actually that was one of the questions, is the agreement with your view on the subnationals, but the subnationals also need to push up because of the inconsistency in some of the policies coming out of the federal government. So the question was, you know, you need to push across and you need to push up.
Yeah, and I think the reality is that wherever the political energy is to do the things that we know need to get done, that's where the activist gaze has to go, you know? So, I mean, there have to be intelligent and strong and ongoing conversations with the ministers at the provincial level right now, for sure. But it's going to be more compelling if the conversations with the municipalities are such that municipalities are coming forward at AMO, for example, which is the Association of Municipalities of Ontario. If some of those mayors can stand up and say, look, these are the things that we're doing. Mr. Premier, how are you going to support us in our greenhouse gas emission reduction? How are you going to help us with the building code so that when developers want to build, they're going to have to build smarter? You know, for example, just, you know, putting in the plugs for electric vehicles. You know, we were building that into the building code so that when you rough up a house, you've got actually the capacity to put those plug-in stations in place. I mean, it sounds like a little thing, but it's the kind of thing that predisposes the economy towards being greener. And so municipalities can demand those kinds of things. They can lead the way right now where there are some gaps in the provincial will.
Right. One question before I turn, a follow-up question from Deborah Pearson. Before I turn to you, I'm trying to manage the Q&A room and the chat room at the same time. But the question, because it's consistent with where we've already been talking, is what do you think, Ms. Nguyen, is the most important action our current Ontario government needs to take to meet our emission reduction targets by 2030?
Well, I think it's in those two areas. I think it's in the vehicle emissions, so transportation, and in building, building code and the incentives in the financial incentives necessarily, but you know, we had put in place a program that was an incentive for people to retrofit their houses, and that got canceled by the current government. We know that the built infrastructure is a huge problem in terms of GHGs. So those two areas, transportation and building, I think is where the government should be focusing if we're talking about mitigation.
Right. Rushay, let me ask you a question. You know, we've talked about where we are now. COP26 is, you know, 11.5 months away. You know, when you think about what youth want to achieve in these 11.5 months and influencing, you know, what should go into the Canadian kit and the Canadian travel bag for Glasgow next year, you know, what would you like to see in it?
Yeah, you know, you're right. It's around the corner. And, you know, so if there's a way to, you know, maybe circle back on, you know, bring the conversation around to where we started, you know, if I think it's about a philosophy of things, you know, if 2015 was the year where, you know, Team Canada crossed party lines, we had this grand political coalition, you know, I think youth really hope that next year is the year that Team Canada goes beyond government, right? And includes communities and marginalized perspectives, as Kathleen mentions, right? That energy is there. And so, you know, I think before we pack our travel bags, you know, to Glasgow, we really have to interrogate discursively, what are the values that underpin the public policy tools that are going to be, that we're going to advance, right, or use, as an example to the rest of the world. And so, personally, I'd like to see the federal government, especially in light of the global stocktake, in which every country is going to be, independently evaluating their contributions and pushing each other and pulling on each other's influences, to take this year and actively consult with, with voices that are often left behind in the delegation, right? So, the reality is that whether the COP process includes youth, broadly speaking, or not, we will be organizing, right? And we will find the venues in which to do so and in which to be heard. And I think that's to Kathleen's point about the nature of that energy. And the consequence of leaving us behind is that agreements that are reached at, at COP or at other fora like it, are not going to have that bite, without that buy-in, from youth. And so I'd like to see the delegation, almost pause and really listen. Do we have the courage to sit down with youth climate groups to draft, agreeable resolutions? Do we have the humility to question the kind of limitations that and the faults of our existing environmental legislation, across the country at various jurisdictional levels? Will we be honest, for instance, and this one is a tough one, about our role as a wealthy nation, as a result of extractive industry, when we know that the largest burdens of the climate crisis will be placed on the poorest in the global south? And will we then commit to reliable long-term, development financing mechanisms that ensure that we're supporting their agency in dealing with the crisis? So, all of these are hard questions, right? But I fundamentally believe that, if youth are asking them, then, I hope that government is willing to meet us halfway. And, if we're truly as we often say we are, a middle power, right? With influence in the rules-based order, I think that acting on our values at home is a strategic diplomatic move. It's one, Kathleen you've made a great point. Examples matter, right? And so when we're able to tell the world that we've adequately engaged, we can then advocate for the same at a global level. So at a multilateral level. So, will we see that kind of engagement from the federal government, to youth, to local communities, to marginalized voices? I'm not holding my breath, but Rosemary, I hope to be proven wrong. All it really takes is a genuine commitment to listening.
And those are such important points and great questions, Rushay. I used to have an argument with Brad Wall when he was Premier of Saskatchewan, because he would always say, well, what difference does it make what Canada does? What difference does it make what Ontario does? What are you going to say to China? And I would say, well, I can't say anything to China until we're doing what we should be doing here, right?
Absolutely.
Rosemary, I just wanted to make 2 points because I saw them in the Q&A, and I know you're trying to manage it too. But the Biden question, I guess I'm still holding my breath to make sure there's not a coup d'état in the United States. But when President Biden is in office, that is going to be another help to the momentum, another boost. I was really happy to hear him talk as much as he did about green in that last debate, about green energy and a green economy. I know after the debates, people were sort of surprised, but I thought, no. This is a 77-year-old man. He knows what is big and what is important. And I think there's at least some hope that we will now have a much better partner. There was another question about, do I know anything about what's happening with the Ontario's and Eastern provinces work with the Northeastern state governors? I actually don't. I don't know that there has been any advancement of that work, which worries me, because I think there were some opportunities there when we were working with Quebec for the Eastern provinces and states to be working together with Central Canada. The other thing I wanted to say, and this is to a question about the fact that natural gas is not clean burning, and I get that when I talk about the electricity grid. I mean, it's peaker power now, but it's becoming more expanded as we see investment in the north. in our long-term energy plan, we had put in place a much bigger number for storage. So green energy that could then be stored. And there are new storage technologies that we should be looking at. So Rosemary, to your earlier question about what should the Ontario government be doing, I believe that in our long-term energy plans, we should build in way more storage than we have. And I think that we need to, if we're thinking about incenting industries, that's a part of the energy industry that needs support and has lots of innovation going on and could help us enormously in our continuity of power across the grid. So I just wanted to raise those 2 points.
Well, thank you for doing that. There's a lot of questions in the Q&A section, and then there's some floating through on the chat. So thank you for co-managing that. Actually going to come to that one from Ted Sheldon. So that's very, very helpful. Another one that has, that I think is applicable to, our discussions on where decision-making and influence lies in the country. Question on, it's to you, Kathleen, on the interconnection between sustainable land use planning and climate change mitigation. And do you see a climate change specific concern with the growing trend to decrease the regulatory power of the municipalities and conservation authorities for new developments?
So this is something that I'm actually very worried about in Ontario. I'm very worried about the conservation authorities losing power. I actually have a question ready for the legislature on ministerial zoning orders, because this is a government now in Ontario that is very much using MZOs, sort of development by fiat, as opposed to development that has to pass through process. We used very few of them. I think we used 2 in the last 2 years of our government. They've used 30. And what that means is that there are community concerns, there are environmental concerns that are being bypassed. And if now on top of that, the regulatory and environmental concerns of conservation authorities are no longer going to have the prominence that they have had, I'm very, very worried about. And what this does is it whittles away at our environmental ecosystem, at our ecosystem. It builds warehouses on wetlands, and we know how dangerous that is to pave over wetlands. So this is something actually that I think we need to really, really focus on and push back against the government. They made a big deal in Ontario, they made a big deal through the election when they were caught, when the premier was caught having a private conversation about the green belt with developers, and they've made a big deal about how we're not going to attack the green belt. Well, okay, but there are lots of protected land and lots of important land outside of the green belt, and if you're going to attack all of that, then that is going to make the job we're talking about even more challenging. So yes, the answer is yes, I'm worried about this. It's something we should all be concerned about, and the government needs to be pushed on it. And that's not even partisan. That's just in terms of us as a human species, we should all be worried about this.
Perfect. There's a question from Marcus Rochefort, and I think it's picking up on your comment about, that housing is one of those areas we need to get on to, along with transportation and agriculture. And it's a long question, so with comments, but maybe I can sum it up probably inadequately, but it's around the issue of, we know we can get to, in the province, to building codes to net zero emission designs, that there's fabulous designs and architectural initiatives and certifications, et cetera, already in place. Why is it not happening? And why is it not happening at least quickly enough? And where's the pushback coming from? How can we accelerate getting to these building codes faster? So
it's not happening as fast as it could, because quite frankly, there's pushback from the industry. People hate change, so that's the starting point. Nobody wants to change, and it takes new technologies and new, as the questioner has said, new design ideas And sometimes it's more expensive. To change, it costs more, and so that changes the bottom line of the developers. And I'll be quite frank with you. The builders didn't love me. There was no love lost between us. But at the same time, what I understood from them and what I know from both business and engineering, if you pose a problem and you say, this is what has to happen, you now work with us to make it happen. If they know what the rules are, then they will make it happen. And there are good developers, there are green developers who can demonstrate that you can build, just like there are developers who can demonstrate that you can build purpose-built rental units and still make money. Although there are many developers who say you can't, but there are some who say you can. We need to take those best examples and we need to extrapolate from them, and we need to make them the models. Unfortunately, right now, we don't have a forum, we don't have a place where government is actually asking those questions. What we have right now is a situation where developers are saying to the government, we had it really bad when those liberals were in office, and now we've got to catch up. But that's about their bottom line, Rosemary. That's about making more money. And I know that the private sector needs to make money. I get that. But we need to, as a society, we need to demand that the framework within which they're working is one that is sustainable. And we just haven't made those demands yet. We did change the building code. When we were in office, we changed the building code. Our building code dovetails with the federal building code, but that's an ongoing process. It is a dynamic document, and it needs to continue to evolve.
There are so many questions in the Q&A, and we are almost out of time. And I think we could continue this conversation for a good part of the afternoon, but unfortunately we cannot. Let me turn to you, Rushay, and then I'm going to turn to Kathleen in 1 minute. Would you like to say, are you optimistic about the pathway to COP26 when we are going to be held accountable? Are we turning the corner? Is this one of the upsides of, if there's any, of COVID, awakening us to global interdependence? 1 minute, a quick sum up.
Sure.
Brilliant, Rushay.
Thanks. Just, really quickly, I think, we talk about the pandemic, about a new normal, right? And I think what has come up is that this idea that, going back to normal isn't really an option, right? It's not viable. It's not something that we truly want to see. And I think noticing the push that we've seen from youth, from other groups prior to the pandemic is indicative of sort of the amounts of consultation that need to happen, right? I would love to see a federal charge that allows us to have the dialogue with regard to COP26 and our contributions on a broad-based sense of what to do. So I personally want to thank all the other youth climate groups that are out there here in Toronto, across the country, and globally, who are continuing to push their governments to say we need to change. We don't have a choice, and all the pandemic has revealed is that it's not the year. It is the wide spate of issues that we were already dealing with, just amplified today.
Thank you very much, Kathleen. Last word.
I just want to thank everybody who has made comments and the questions. Thank you for being so engaged. Rosemary, that's what makes me optimistic, is that there are such smart people who are thinking about these things and are wanting to take action. So I guess the only thing I would say is we're in a very strange moment because of the pandemic. And I think Rushay has touched on that really well. Let's make sure that we don't let the anxiety around the pandemic from political leaders. I mean, you got to know, premiers and mayors are going to bed every single night. They are tossing and turning, worried about rising numbers of cases. They're making good or bad decisions depending on the day, depending on who we're talking about. But they are all absorbed with that issue. But let's not let that deter us from pushing on, focusing on these other things, because that's an abdication of responsibility. You know, we are going to come through this one way or another. Normal was not so shit hot to start out with, so who wants to go back to normal really anyway? But I really think that we have to not let ourselves get completely sidetracked by the anxiety of COVID and lose track of some of these other issues. It's important that conservation authorities are losing their power. It's important that we have an opportunity to build on electric cars. You know, those are things that have to be part of the discussion. So I would just say to all the people in the discussion and the chat room, take action where you can, you know, talk to political leaders, whether they agree with you or not. In fact, especially if they disagree with you, go, you know, call your conservative members and have conversations with them, because they have an influence. And, you know, there has to be political will at all 3 levels of government if we're going to get through this. So thank you so much, everybody.
Well, thank you both Rushay and Kathleen for a wonderful conversation, a really important one. And you're right, all of us can do something. We can take action. We can speak out, have a conversation, write. You know, we live in a place, even in a lockdown place, where we can still take action and not lose sight of these other important issues. So thank you all very much. Thank you to all the participants who listened in. Next week, we will be doing a climate negotiation simulation. We'll be talking to some financial CEOs about their role in transitioning to a low zero carbon economy. And we're going to wrap up the series with music and art and culture. So please continue to join us. Thank you again, Kathleen and Rushay.